Good morning. I'm sorry. Thank you, Martha. It's a pleasure today to speak with Deputy Porfirio Muñoz Ledo. I lived in Mexico for the first time, 74, 75, during the time of Luis Echeverria. Yes, more than 50 years ago, and still have good memories of your activities in the government of President Echeverria. And then I lived there during the time of Lopez Portillo, a tragic figure in the history of Mexico, I'd say. You're right. There was a drama within him. He was ambivalent. People were extremely excited and also depressed. Yes, before I die, I think I'm going to write a Greek tragedy about his history. None of my Mexican friends believe me, but I'm going to try. One day, I'm going to have had enough of that. Let me give you a tip. Watch the movie 8½. That's the title of the movie, 8½. And the character shown there is loved by women, but misunderstood by everybody else. Okay, if it's on Netflix, I'll watch it, surely. Yes, I'll send it to you. Okay, Deputy, your political career for 50 years, I think it's longer. You've been a minister of governments. I mean, I've got a list of the positions you've held. I was a labor secretary as well. President of PRI, co-founder or founder of the movement within PRI, and then you left PRI to become the co-founder of PRD, senator of PRD, twice president, or at least twice president of the Chamber of Deputies, and then you supported President Fox of PAN, another party, the only one that, at least in modern times, that has been president of two political parties in Mexico is you. And then, beginning in 2005, you began to support the candidacy of AMRO, of Lopez Obrador for his presidency. Yes, you're right. And you've been supporting him since then. So my first question for you is, well, we see that you've changed parties, political parties through time. So really, what are the main principles for those changes? And what's your vision of Mexico? Well, it's really simple. Let me simplify this for you. The PRI back then was a party, but within, like all large political parties, like the Labourists of Great Britain or that Liberal Party of Canada, there are extremes as well. Left, right, center, or simply chameleons that change colors. Early on, because of my education and my origin, I was identified from the left, a representative of the left, as well as Octavio Cardenas, whose father was a good president of Mexico. And so there was a time of this period of history that we now call neoliberalism. It's consensus. So the Mexican political class of the PRI started to divide into branches. So Lopez Portillo tried to keep control, but since he failed significantly because of the overproduction of oil, and our debt, he opted to work with Miguel, who was educated in Mexico. He was really orthodox more, and he started to work at the UN. Me, as many intellectuals, I wasn't really a member of the PRI, but of the administration. So what happened? We started to have different positions. I experienced something very important, which was the movement of the new development of countries in 1975. So we started to have different criterias, and I started to speak with them. And when I went back to Mexico, several, not me alone, but also Friday Martinez, the first doctor of Mexico from Harvard, took a different path, ideological. Why? Everything, all of our differences were ideological. It wasn't because we had a better position with the system. We were okay there. So before coming back from the UN, I was an ambassador and a member of the Security Council. And what hit me most is that I was elected a president of the group of 77 that was created in 74 by leaders from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And we were many more, but that really marked me because it was an exercise for global economic trade. So it's really what we're discussing now. Up to where can we have a common understanding? It wasn't a struggle, but instead it was more negotiation, but it failed because the direct economic direction of the world went in another path. So there are two things that I realized. One, that we were in a situation that was false because Mexico criticized the dictatorships of Latin America. Pinochet, the rebels, the white hand of El Salvador, the generals of Argentina. But all of a sudden, some of my colleagues of PRI in Mexico started to say that Mexico wasn't a democracy. It wasn't but I mean, we did have elections, but the party was such a majority, the really elections were more a formalism. So with others, I came back to Mexico and I gave a very strong speech and I said, we are internally democratic, but something that very different outside. I mean, we're like the light outside and darkness inside. And I had spoken with many other ambassadors, not of career, but because practically we said that on the left side, we were outside now, we're no longer in. And we created La Corriente Democrática within the same party. A year later, they couldn't stand us anymore. So we were expelled from the party. Well, we were attacked to the point that we have no other thing to do. I mean, we were called the Troja horse. So we founded a democratic current that was still within the party, but there was a division, like it happens worldwide in many political parties. So we launched a candidacy to the presidency of the Republic to compete within the party. In the bylaws, you could have internal campaigns, but nobody did, but we did. So that created a situation in Mexico, totally new, because we had more support, we in the street, than the others, than the socialists. However, they made a historical fraud, the largest electoral fraud of Mexico. And they did it before, during, and after changing the voting polls and everything. So we declared that we were rebels and we founded the National Democratic Front with small parties, and then the PRI2, and there things changed. So you can say that I have been part of the PRI, the PRD, and now I'm member of the Morena movement, but I'm not really part of the party. The thing is that several parties have backed me. After that, we had a problem because instead Eugenio Cardenas, our candidate, that he did win with all the fraud. Then came Salinas de Gortari, a smart, sly guy, and a person that had a strong fist. He had a lot of ties with Washington. He brought a huge wave of privatizations in Mexico. And that's what history has been about. Oh, in 1988, I am elected Senator of Mexico, and I focused on two, and then two in Michoacan. So you could say we had a notorious activity because we're the only ones. We had to debate with everybody else. And many times we won all of the debates, but we lost all the votes, strangely enough. So what happens with Fox? In Mexico, we had to take a step towards internet. Vicente Fox, which at the end was quite frivolous. And I nicknamed him as the vacuum. We worked together in Guanajuato, and he was a struggler, a fighter. And I thought that if we joined both extremes, PRD and PAN, we could reach a majority. We had done it in the Chamber of Deputies when I was the president. Dr. Cedillo, an economist, didn't know much about politics. And there was a terrible devaluation in 1975. And he made all of the electoral reforms. I was part of 5. So Mexico acquired, and now is an example of an electoral system that's quite perfect with all the resources, jurisdictional resources needed. So we won by two votes, all against all the opposition, then PRI. So the others didn't want to give us the presidency of the chamber, but we did take over. So I was asked to respond to Cedillo, and their big movement began then. In the 2000, PRI lost the elections in Mexico. Of course, it was an alliance between a reasonable left and a democratic right. But then we had Calderón, and then we joined and supported. In 2006, we didn't make it because fraud was made in 2012 either. And lastly, we made it now in 2018. And there we are on the path. I went back to the Chamber of Deputies, and there I am, fighting still. Yes, you're really fighting. You're in the middle of it. So I'd like to talk about now in 2018, you ran for the chamber and you supported the candidacy of López Obrador. But what have been your expectations early on to back him, especially with the 4th transformation? And also, what's your idea? What's your opinion of that fourth transformation as it is announced? That is a great question. Okay. I am not going to talk about, I'm not going to talk badly about a government that I still support. Indeed, I asked President Lopez Obrador that if I could place on him the presidential band, and I did. That is something I did. The issue is neoliberalism over in Mexico or not? For me, theoretically, it's not over yet. If the economic structure of the country struggles against that change because of the 4T, where does the 4T comes from? What in 2000? No, the movement that I formed in 2000, it's called Movement for a New Republic, or the Fourth Mexican Republic, keeping in mind that the first one was for the movement of independence, the second was the one of reforms, and the third was the Mexican Revolution. So I still insist, and I am a professor of constitutional law, that Mexico needs a deep reform of its constitution because there are many contradictions in it. So my movement has always pushed for a new constitution. And that was the slogan of the campaign of Lopez Obrador. And I mean, I hope not to die, to at least write down, written down a new constitution. So the economic and political situation of the country led Lopez Obrador to not talk about a new constitution because everybody could be frightened about it, saying, no, that's a communist or it's something socialist. But instead, he started to talk about the fourth transformation to provide few and strategic reforms to the Constitution, but to make a big shift ahead. So the fourth 14 really is the expression that substitutes a reform of the Constitution. So this is really what's important for me. We need to have texts in every political movement. We have to make coherence, because if we're going to change a reform, that's a big thing. And there are two documents right now that we have. One is the Democratic Proposal of 1982, and the other is the first program of the Democratic Revolution. It's a big book that I coordinated when it comes to the democratic, economic, social aspects. Those are the founding documents. However, things have changed today. And a government sometimes has to be more pragmatic in specific things. The country does not have a favorable economic condition. That's a fact. For different reasons, the growth of the GDP has stopped. And it stopped not because of the political change, but because of serious circumstances that have dropped its growth rate. So now there's an estimate that we can reach -7 of our GDP. But the president says, the day before yesterday, he talked about justice and everything. But the case is that we do have a serious economic problem in Mexico. Oil is another problem. So for me, it's very important to recover in Mexico our principles, the boost. And that's where we stand now. I not only write criticisms against the government, but I do have a posture because I have the moral and ethics to do so. And the little time I have left, I want to write every article. I write one every week, and each article is focused on a problem. For instance, SMEs, the problems of the minimum wage. What I think that could solve the problems that we have, for instance, I believe that Mexico is more than ever, it should focus on a fair minimum wage. Instead of looking at small social problems, it should look at more at its minimum wage. That's the main issue. And there are many, many other topics because, well, let me jump a bit, but it's a conclusion. I am very concerned that people see what's happening is because of the feedback of the sanitation and economic crisis as something that is on a long-term basis. In Mexico, we're talking about the new normal, but I think we're far from that. And we need to speak about what's coming, and not only in Mexico, but with the world. So I'm worried about the virus, yes. But I do see a light at the end of the tunnel that's farther away. There's an article that I wrote that, for instance, I was reading the other day an article that Kissinger wrote about the new order. That's something I agree on. I don't know if it's an exaggeration of my own, but I'm quite realistic, really. Now I'm trying to work on long-term things, matters. That's something else that we can talk about. Thank you, Deputy. And I understand when you're talking about long-term matters. And I understand that you don't want to criticize the government. However, we've seen that you're not satisfied and have not been quiet about overload in the current government. And many people say that you are the consciousness of the Moreno movement and even of the country. And those differences that we see with the government are of not minor. These are fundamental basis of democracy. If I'm really not good at politics, but you've created a constitutionality, the separation of powers, human rights, and other concepts. And sometimes you've even used strong words, hypocrites, like suck-ups or bootlickers. It's like a bootlicker. So you have not been quiet about this. Can we talk about these differences that you have, deep differences that you have with the current government? There are two topics that we can address right now. One is the immigration policy that you have strongly criticized, and the Budget Act, which is the hottest potato in Mexico. Can you talk about your concerns with the current government today? Okay, let me make a parentheses. I've always been the same. That's the thing. I mean, when I had the first important position with Liceo Echeverria as the subsecretary of the presidency, it's like I propose discourses and everything, and I was always the progressive side. I always had differences with my bosses. When I was the Secretary of Labor, there were many strikes, and we reached the highest minimum wage of the country. We increased 23% in a year of the minimum wage. So then I left the Portillo government because of that, and there are many other intrigues. I was appointed the Secretary of Education, which is a huge position because it has to do with with everything has to do with education. I had to coordinate the cabinet, and then I left as well. Then I went to California, and I was in the north. I went also to Brazil, to Argentina. I traveled to England, France, and I brought new ideas from those trips. I mean, I have a position, not against governments per se, but I have a role with different ideas, and that's not new. And there are people in the government that don't agree with me, especially there are external forces that try to undermine what I say. I must say that with the secretaries of state or ministers, I've really gotten along well. But I am in favor of independence of the legislative power. Certainly, we are part of the same movement, but we do need more independence. I was really mad when I appeared in the media because there's a law that we are supporting, but I changed two things because I thought that they could improve. And about social programs, the project said never can they be less than the year before. And I said instead, what I said is that all the resources should be placed at this position. But since I didn't have a line, my own people attacked me. So I don't agree many times. I mean, there are many colleagues that don't have the same intellectual level because there's a lot of people that have been taking political positions just because they're friends of others. They don't have the intellectual level that they need. So it's not that I go against the government. I just try to make suggestions, improvements. Since I've been like that, since I was a student leader, even as a Mexican diplomat, I've been an ambassador in the UN and in the European Union. I've had ties with authorities and try to improve things. So it's not that I'm against the government, but I've been a vigilant of my ideas, and I'm entitled historically because I am a member of the party to do things, to say things. And there are other things that I'm still going to do. So why wasn't there as a deputy before? I don't want to say that doesn't support. I mean, U.S. up to a certain point has been alone in that fight for the separation of powers. I mean, basic and fundamentals. So why are you the only voice? Why isn't anybody else backing you? That's why I said that day I got up to change two things, and everybody said I was right. All of my colleagues applauded me, and I left the podium. And then everybody sat down and voted against me. What I'm against is the line. There are more papals than the papal than the Pope. I have always said that it's very difficult to handle a democratic majority. In the PRI, I changed the line, and that was it. So I'm against that we do not grant a creative role to the deputies. Of course, I've gotten certain experience that allows me to contribute. In short, there's a centralism. Since we have the proposal of the executive, that's how it's got to be. So it doesn't accept any variations, not even a word. And that's against what I believe in. In my case, and in my age, with my years of experience, as a legislator, I have many projects to make reforms. I have presented a bill to change some things in our exterior policy. for whatever party. Also, there I have another one on migration. I have a project. I have a bill as well on several things on the federalism, more freedom and resources for the municipalities of the state. These are this is for all the collectives. So I present those bills and nobody pays attention. So we can only legislate now voting in favor of things. In the time of the elect president, I was part of a group of having common proposals, but nothing has happened. So I still fight for the proposals that I presented and that I think are proper. I think that they're good. Thank you, Deputy. Now let's talk a minute to what everybody's talking about today, which is the COVID. Internationally, Mexico has not shown the best face. It's not stood out in two aspects: the very low number of tests and the little support, economic support given to the businesses, especially the SMEs. Can you talk about what the government has done and what do you propose to improve this management? SMEs and the economy. Okay, Mexico right now, let me see, death 4,220, confirmed 40,000 active cases, people's tested 148,000. Okay, there are two viewpoints here. First, when it comes to managing the coronavirus, I think they've done well because there's a vice minister, the subsecretary that has become very famous. His name is Lopez-Gatell, who does give security assurance. What has failed, however, is the hospital system, is the healthcare system. And early on is the lack of discipline. Let me touch one of the points. In this long period that we call neoliberal, because of the shrinkage of the state, we started to see more holes in the system. I was the general secretary of the Mexican Institute of the Social Security System. And we thought back then that the Social Security system was the largest of Latin America. But then there were problems. For instance, the Social Security stopped managing the pensions and moved it to the hands of private entities. So that, of course, created havoc in the healthcare system. So we have a deficit of the installed capacity of the Mexican hospitals that's enormous. Our physicians are great. So, and also we have a lot of corruption in the healthcare system. Today, in today's newspapers, there's a series of imports that were really conflicts of interest that would give way to corruption, so these were stopped. So that's one point. The other point, and I want to say this clearly, I don't want to be criticized by others. Overall, the Latin American people have two things. What we call the chorcha and apapacho. The chorcha is that we love to be together. My boss in Social Security, he said that in the hospitals of the towns, you don't need a hospital. I mean, there's an agglomeration in hospital, and the papacho, which is body language. We love to hug. We love to touch each other. So there's an enormous possibility of a contagion, of spreading, because we've never had a discipline like the one we've been asked for the past 2 months. So I believe that we need a lot to do still. What worries me today? To talk about the new normal so early on. They're saying now that you can open entire towns. But I think we need a more rigorous analysis. Up to where can we say that we are defeating this virus? Only with two things. We need a massive investment in hospitals and to really bet on science, nationally and internationally. I can imagine that the struggle is quite basic. It's for mankind. It's science against this disease. I mean, if this year we don't have a vaccine, if there's some type of remedy is good, but I believe that if we don't have effective vaccines, things are going to last long. Second, I've got my own thesis, and I think I agree with what's happening with the world, the loans, the credits. How can we finance this struggle against the coronavirus? And how can we reactivate or reopen economies? I mean, here in Mexico, everybody hates debt because the governors of the old regime would give loans without collateral, and they started to build luxury homes, and they started to earn a lot of money. So everybody hates credits. Also, as a country, we have the experience of the intent letters of the International Monetary Fund. Remember, it said, we could loan you this, but you have to do this. And that happened. Now, loans are seen differently. Firstly, constitutionally, they are of the nation. This generation cannot pay them. The collateral is national goods. Second, the loan, the credit is cheap. It's at almost 0%, 0.1 or 0.05. So it's time to take the loans. The topic that's related to this is the fiscal deficit. Mexico has struggled, as other countries, because it has a primary surplus, to spend less than what it has. However, the primary deficit is also for paying debts. The United States, has reached 12% of its deficit fiscal. When I was an ambassador of Europe, it was from 3 to 5%. And now the countries, all of Europe together is at 6%. You've got Italy at 7%. So we have to accept the fiscal deficit. If not, we cannot reopen the economy. We cannot fight with loans. Besides, the monetary fund is starting to look at the debts. Here I have an article on the Marshall Plan. What was invested in the Marshall Plan, it was billions. So when there's an emergency, you need the credits with very low interest rates, with enough guarantees, and credits that are institutional, not for consumers. And that's something that I think about a lot. We think about those. I don't think that any economy in the world can pay this. I mean, here I have a figure. Here I've got the figures of the Plan Marshall. So, another difference, I believe that the social programs which have featured lately, and a very good idea, López Obrador, who began as a governor of Mexico City, which provided scholarships to students, programs for senior citizens. Really, everything was focused. And that was a huge effort that was very much supported by voters. But here I've got this file. I am really, really in favor of the basic income, and many countries have it, even Brazil, for the poorest. So who's the best ideologist for me of the universal income basic? Silicon Valley, because for a long time it's been working on robotics, and it knows that there will be many, many unemployed people with robotics. So it's got this program. Alaska has it, but tagged to its oil. Others tagged to scientific and technological investments. I believe that today in this crisis, a basic income is a great solution. There's an institution called the National Evaluation Committee that suggests that the vital minimum is 2,760 pesos a month. So let's take that figure, and for everybody to earn that and use, and it's perfectly payable, perfect. So you start to see how many problems are solved at the same time. Some cases would require special attention. For instance, with SMEs, small and medium enterprises, the micro enterprises, small and medium enterprises, 97% of these are really micro. Micro are those that have less than 5 employees, where you go to everything that has less than 5 employees. If there's a universal basic wage, that's good. So here are 2 things to think about. The large entrepreneur that wants to be the heroes of the SMEs, as if they were pawns in a chess game, or the soldiers of a war. So we've got to have a vision that is not disruptive, that does not create conflicts. It's a truth. It's a fact. Medium enterprises depend more on large companies. They're suppliers. They do not provide the public, and they have interest. For instance, the credit is paid by medium-sized enterprises because they sell what they have to sell and they're paid later. So we've got to do something different. Mexico, like many countries in Latin America, has a very good fiscal base because there are many workers. The workers that live off informally, that live off selling things on the street is a complicated issue, and they're not registered. We should register them. We've got to know how many people we're talking about, really. Who has a boss? So the idea that I presented is that the fiscal data should register everything and should back these people with employment or with a universal minimum wage. And when this ends, which I don't think will be tomorrow, it's got all of the small people, all of the people that have small businesses and micro businesses facing this crisis better. I always think about what's going to happen tomorrow and the day after and the day after. And these are some differences that I have with the current government. Here in this file, I have the Economic Pact, all of the initiatives that have been made in Latin America. Here are 8 points that I presented for the Morena party. And there are many coincidences. It's not true that I have huge differences with the current government. I propose, yes, tell me. No, I didn't want to interrupt you, but going back a minute, you've got to stop me, I'm sorry. I don't want to abuse of your time either, no problem. And remember, we have questions from our listeners, and I'd like to make a couple. But going back to the sanitation, I understand this custom and habit in Latin America and Mexico, especially, of hugging. I mean, that's something that however, yeah, but there are left and right-wing governments are imposing the quarantine, mandatory quarantine. Instead, Mexico never has asked for a mandatory quarantine, and instead is talking about just social awareness. And there are many complaints because there's a lack of basic things to protect nurses and healthcare workers. And they are heroes, yes. Unfortunately, in Latin America, now I'm in Colombia, but when you talk about the policy of Mexico about the COVID, it's related to Brazil. And that's not good at all. Very little people like that. So do you still want to defend the government's position regarding its sanitation measures regarding this crisis? The general indications given have been good. I believe that. The problem is the level of discipline, which has taken too long. First. Second is the problem that we have with our hospital care. And third, which concerns me the most, is that we talk about the new normal as of now. It says that by June, we're okay, but I think that that's far from true. The government, many governments in the world want to give that normalcy because it has to do with reopening the economy. But people will not be working. People will be working, teleworking, and things are different now. Now we have the problem with the states. Mexico sells a lot to the states in car parts. Indeed, we have a surplus compared to the states. We sell more to the states than the states to us. So there's pressure all over the place, and I understand that there are different positions in the government. So that's the issue. And my worry is that that will really delay the solution to this problem of the pandemic. I really think that we have to look at the minimum vital wage. If you're going to be home, the state can pay you to stay home. And there's money for everybody with that minimum wage. I agree with many things that have been said before. And I'm thinking of what the president has said about the main, especially with what the Secretary of Health and the Secretary of Economy have said. And also, I've been listening to what the governors of the states have been saying. Each governor has different situations. Then I look at what the congressmen are saying, and the workers, economists, and scientists. So I think that we need a national council that collectively takes everybody's, all of the sectors in mind, because there's so many voices right now that I think that there's more contradictions than anything else. We have a National Council of Health, but economically it's not doing well. Scientifically, yes, but economically, no. I really believe that we need an emergency economic policy. That's what I think we need. Okay, thank you, Deputy. We have very little time left. Allow me to touch the relationship in the future between Mexico, Canada, and the US. And also I'd like to ask you, do you allow me to smoke? No problem. I really think about that topic. The topic with Canada is important to me. So let's begin with that. What should be the relationship between Mexico, Canada, and the States, especially today when there's, I mean, I can imagine that you're more in tune with the politics of Canada than that of the States. So could you tell us what you think? There are two different things, really. I've always thought that separate of having the three countries together, there are topics that are more for all three and others that are more for two countries of the three. I was a pioneer of the relationship with Canada. When I was an academic, we held meetings with academics of Canada, and we started to work on the beef sandwich theory, which is great. We also created some structures. The first employee agreement was launched by me as a Minister of Employment and of Labor. And we prepare the people and we send them to almost tailor-made according to what the Canadians needed. Now there are two new programs with other features. I've got the papers here. So I would say that Mexico and Canada has had very good bilateral relations. The chairman of, we hope, you're talking about St. John, the best lobsters I've had in my life have been in Canada. Nothing like, not even a Maine. I've had a meeting recently with Canadian academics, and I said something to them and it's not the idea here to criticize the states. There are things of Canada and also topics of Mexico that don't go with the states. So Mexico, Canada have relationships that have topics that the states are not included in or don't like. So I think that we have to look at common grounds. That's a big thing. I went with Trudeau, father, in 1972, I was also a professor in the University of Laval in Quebec. I know French, by the way. And I made a campaign against the FTA with the NDP, who was an ambassador, Sipple Lewis. I don't know if you knew him. And so I really have a lot of friends. I was a very good friend of Canadian ambassadors. And I know Canada well. So I think we have very good ties, for instance, with renewable energy, water usage, social balancing measures. So we have to look at the range of things. Mining, here we believed that mining of Canadian companies weren't very good with nature or with the rights of the indigenous groups. However, now I'm aware that these are companies that are headquartered in Canada. Another topic that separated was the asylum and migration and tourism, because Canadians could enter there through asylum. But to give a visa, you needed a bunch of requirements from here. Since Columbus used the Tupacum time, when I was in Ottawa, I was introduced in a balcony to the parliament. And a friend told me, said, hey, there's Porfirio. So I asked them from the balcony in English, have we agreed practically on everything? No. Now let's look at everything in detail. For instance, if Mexico built a rocket, it would be great for Canada, right? Less for the US, because Panama is a canal, not a rocket, a canal. It would be great for Canada. The US already has Panama. Also, Canada has a huge influence in the Caribbean. Part of its Commonwealth is there. I have friends in Venezuela. They have covered the Caribbean shore, and they give Spanish lessons there as well, giving Spanish lessons in Jamaica. They were really close to Venezuela because Venezuela gave them oil, and it was like a burden for Venezuela. But the influence of Canada in the Caribbean is huge. So we can make huge economic competitions, political as well. I remember when I went to Canada once, that we almost went there to beg Canada to be part of the OAS. Canada didn't want to be part of it because it really didn't want to have so many ties with the States, but it did with us. So in the international setting, Canada for us, for a long time, has been a like-minded country, especially it could be with other countries, with countries that agree on their ideologies, because they have a pro-UN mind of thought. So we had great combinations. Today's ambassador in Mexico in Ottawa, his name is Marquez. And he's made a treaty on the migration issue. So we have many issues like human rights. I understand that Canada now is a candidate to be part of a constant member of the Security Council. Mexico as well. I think it's the first time in history in which Mexico and Canada are non-permanent members of the Security Council. They're phenomenal ties that we have with both countries. I have been in contact for both countries with the disciples of Mario Suarez. And now in the UN, we have many problems. So when it comes to the formation, Canada, Mexico have many things to do together, I believe. Thank you, Deputy. Talking about another product of Canada, which is of interest for capital Canadians, is cannabis. Oh, of course. So this has been highly discussed in the Congress of Mexico. What's your position? I mean, medicinal cannabis to begin with, but it could be expanded. What's your opinion about this? Very advanced, especially thinking is on the experience of Uruguay. It's been the best. The Minister of Mexico of Governance is a jurist. She was a minister of the court, and she always defended the cannabis matter. Medicinal cannabis is authorized under medical supervision. The entertainment cannabis has its exceptions. Now in Mexico, we have an amnesty for the chains, the small consumers, the small producers, small traders. I'm in favor, and I've had a TV program. I made many TV programs about this, that during the time of General Cardenas, Mexico should have an official selling point. I mean, we sell the cannabis in anywhere, but I think that we should have places specifically to sell only the cannabis, and that way we can finish the hypocrisy. I remember in New York, in my apartment building, at the very entrance, there was a pot with cannabis. So I believe that there should be permissions and prohibitions. For instance, teenagers, they can have up to 8 milligrams. So I think it should be regulated, the volume. Thank you, Deputy. And that posture is similar to other drugs. Ex-President Cedillo is part of the Commission of Drugs, or the commission, exactly, Cardoso, Cedillo, Santos, and they talk about the regularization, not legalization necessarily, of drugs, but not criminalization. Do you have the same opinion of the other drugs? Yes, but there's got to be a control. I mean, in General Clark's time, it was the control of the state. But let's look at what Uruguay has done. You have to look at different hypotheses. There's a problem with other drugs, yes, especially with the flower. And something that's very important are the synthetic drugs. But I'm only talking about cannabis here. I'm in favor of its not criminalization, clearly and openly. The program of the ex-presidents is very good. Firstly, nobody dies there. Nobody has died from that. Many more people die of this cigarette than from cannabis, and it's not prohibited. I made a joke in a conference. I said, yes, I know that died of cannabis. Where? The person was crossing the street and a bale of cannabis was dropped on their head. So my problem is the relationship with the other drugs. And there, I don't have an answer. We have the heroin, but for instance, in Mexico, in Chiapas, for instance, or in Guerrero, where it's planted, if you go against them, the people starve. I mean, it's a very serious problem. I don't have a provision. I don't have information. I don't have diagnostic of what can be done on that with the synthetic drugs. No. The frontier with synthetic drugs have got to be handled differently, of course, than cannabis. I don't know if you know, in Canada during the quarantine, cannabis has been rated as an essential product like food and medicine. Let me ask you another question. I don't want to abuse of your time. It's talked about in the business world that after closing the airport, a cancellation referendum is bad for Mexico. Do you think that with the current government, you are aware of what are the rules? Having technical problems? Jesse. Okay. Look, early on, the government had a series of problems like that derived from the electoral campaign. The airport of Toluca, which is had a large operation of the prior president, Peña Nieto, because he's from there, from that state. And it was thought to have a large airport like the ones that were built in Mexico before. So a group of persons close to the power purchased large extensions of land to build a big airport. And of course, I denounced that and said that those lands were being bought for Peña Nieto. So when he took position, there were many captains. I mean, there's even money for pensions was used for that. So that was a big problem for the country. It was difficult for the government to say that the airport could be good after using the money really badly. I think that if there was more discussions made with investors, it would have been better. So it became a private airport, but I don't know if all the possibilities were explored to have mixed airport or private airport, but it was a big blow to Peña Nieto. However, I think the emblematic programs like the Maya train or the transformer, they want to pick. Those also have a big division, but Slim already won last week, was awarded last week a bid. I mean, here the topic is, what will we invest in? That's it. We have new priorities in terms of investments. I mean, first we've got to invest in healthcare, followed by housing. But for that, we need good salaries. So you have to have the public expense, and we've got to have the fiscal deficit. So the order of the priorities: one, spending the money honestly and disclosing the real things to be open with the people. That's why I talk about this concept. I really think that the banks are interested as well in participating. And we have another problem in Mexico. We're talking about low interest rates, but internationally, but in Mexico, it's got to be high because then we have a devaluation. So the policy is very specific. In my opinion, we cannot continue with the status quo. There's got to be a national alliance. I am in favor of the national alliance, of expanding the bases. That's why it's called a policy of the state, which is like a constitution. No matter what. Who would think that there are changes? The same with the internal or domestic economic policy. There are minimums. I think Mexico is, the first task is to say, what's the base of the national agreement? What do we agree on? In the States, there are more deportations of Mexicans during Obama than during Trump's era. That's an ongoing policy of the states. Mexico and many other countries, and in Europe as well. I was a professor and a student in Europe, and I know well the European policies. And they have a minimum. Oh, by the way, these documents, the one of the European Union, is extraordinary because it has measures for the entire union and then variables. How is it possible that the European Union, which is not one country, but a set of many countries, can reach the same basis for the entire union? That's fantastic. I recommend it. If you don't have it, I'll send you a copy. So we have a national policy that's basic on everything: education, investments, exterior foreign policy. That's ours. It's a definition of national interest. If a country does not know constantly its national interest, it cannot have international a seat internationally. I really believe that Mexico right now has 11 treaties with 42 countries, so we have to know what is the national interest to be able to have better ties with countries overseas. It's the idea is to give priority to the citizens soon, so that we don't lose sight of what we need. We cannot say that we're against the public or the private sector. We can talk about everything sitting at a table. Thank you so much, Deputy, for your time. Next time I go to Mexico, let's go eat some lobsters in the Atlantic provinces. I wouldn't dare to take cannabis, but let's talk about Charlie and Lopez and many other things. But for now, I would like to thank you so much. Thank you for being with us. I hope it's not the last time we have a talk about this. What a pleasure. And remember, Gabo. We already talked about Gabo, yes. Again, thank you. Thank you for the listeners as well. And we'll see you next time, next week, when we have another webinar on the reopening of Peru after COVID. But thank you all. The only Latin American country that has savings is Peru. But they have more dead than savings. Yeah, let's end it that way. Let's close it this way. Thank you, Deputy. Thank you all. Thank you.